My name is Sean Bowman. I am a member of the ESX and ESXi product management team. And with me I have...
I'm Charu Chobal, and I work in technical marketing, also working on ESXi in VMware.
Great. And we're going to be switching off during the talk. So I'm going to take the first section. Charu will join me on stage and run through a whole bunch of really cool information about transitioning to ESXi with vSphere 4.1. So let's get right into it. Assuming the clicker would work. All right, no clicker. It's going to be manual. Guys, I assume everybody reads release notes, right? Right? Okay, so in case you didn't read the release notes for the ESXi and ESX 4.1 release, I'll help you a little bit and I'll read this out to you. It's really, really important, so I'll go to the trouble. VMware vSphere 4.1 and its subsequent update and patch releases are the last releases to include both ESX and ESXi hypervisor architectures. Yeah, that's right, the last releases. Future major releases of VMware vSphere will include only the VMware ESXi architecture. So you may have heard rumblings about this. Now there's a really fixed timeline. So the key message, if you remember nothing else about this session, other than the party, of course, because no one's going to forget that one, is ESXi is coming. The transition will happen in the second half of next year, and now is really the right time to start moving from ESX to ESXi if you haven't already done so. So the rest of the talk is just going to help you make that a reality. Okay, so I'm going to run through a couple of slides to give you an overview of ESXi. And let's start, well, what's ESXi? Well, I'm going to pause a little bit here and say it's not the free product. I know a lot of people think ESXi is free and it's some way a lesser version of ESX. This is not correct at all. So really, we have two hypervisor architectures. The one is called ESX, which you know and love. The other one is called ESXi, which is our next generation hypervisor. And they differ fundamentally from an engineering perspective, and I'll go into some of those differences. Probably the most important thing here is ESXi is a full-featured hypervisor. It runs all the same VMs as ESX. It performs just the same as ESX. It is just as scalable. In fact, it's a little bit more scalable than ESX, right? Where it starts to get different is we believe it is much more secure and more reliable, and I'll explain why that's the case as we go through the slides, and Charu will tell you more about that as well. But the key difference between ESX and ESXi is that we've taken away a massive chunk of code, the console OS, which was responsible for the vast majority of the patches, security issues, and just general code maintenance, which have nothing really to do with virtualization. It's a management console which we can do away with. So once you remove all of that code, you slim down the hypervisor to a much, much smaller footprint. It makes it much more secure and much easier to maintain. So that brings us to the next point, streamlined deployment and configuration. ESXi is pretty tiny. In fact, it's so tiny that you can go to one of your favorite vendors and get ESXi embedded directly in the hardware, just like you get a BIOS. You get that box, you rack it up, you power it on, ESXi is up and running. That's pretty cool. We couldn't do that with the ESX architecture. That means the process of being able to deploy ESXi onto servers becomes much, much faster. It's that much smaller. The next one is things like configuration and automation around ESXi is designed to be a lot simpler. So the console OS is a pretty complicated place to live, and there are a lot of agents that people would put in there, a lot of configuration, a lot of maintenance stuff, which you just don't have to do on ESXi. Much, much simpler. We've also got some other pretty cool things here. I make that claim there that there's a smaller code base that equals fewer patches. Well, that's a great claim, but let me back that up by some stats. We did a study on the patching frequency on the ESX 3.5 release series. And we compared ESX patching frequency versus ESXi patching frequency. And it turns out on ESXi, they're 1/10 the number of patches. So if you translate that into how much time I'm actually spending going through my estate and upgrading everything and ensuring everything is in compliance, that's huge. It's a really, really big change, really, really valuable with ESXi. Another cool feature down there, dual image approach. It turns out that ESXi actually has two images inside of it. So if something happens to go wrong in an update of this, you can always roll back to an earlier version, which is a pretty cool feature. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Yeah, I always like this one where somebody else says exactly what I did, and I didn't have to say this. But this is what Gartner is saying about ESXi. Really, really lightweight, and that's, smaller really is key. Far fewer patches. And you'll see, and Chara will go into a lot of the details here, that the management operations around ESXi are pretty different. You don't have to spend a lot of time inside of a console OS. We've taken most of that management and moved it off-host. Chara will give you lots of options for how you could administer ESXi boxes. And we completely agree with what Gartner is saying here in terms of encouraging our customers to move over. I would say now is actually the perfect time to be doing it, and I'll tell you a little bit about 4.1. Chara will tell you a lot more about 4.1, and you'll see why we think now actually is really the right time to start looking at doing this. Okay, this slide I compare on the left-hand side, classic VMware ESX, and on the right-hand side, ESXi. And I'm going to do a kind of a top-down architectural discussion of what's actually in the chunk of software that we have. So on the left, classic ESX has the service console. So the big difference between the left and the right is the service console is gone on the right, which means you have to do some things differently, right? I will make the claim, and we'll go through this, and Chara will back this one up with a lot of information, that everything that you have on the left-hand side has an analog on the right. So if you had things like hardware agents, which you'd installed in the console OS and had to update in the console OS and administer in the console OS, those move off of the host entirely. We've taken the management infrastructure and said, hey, there's a better way of doing this. Just do it through the APIs. Don't install anything on the box. That's painful for our customers to have to deal with. Use the APIs. We'll expose up all the information that you need right against that set of APIs. That's how we deal with management agents. You just take them off the box. We don't need them. What about hardware? A lot of hardware monitoring information that you'd want to be able to surface up. Did a fan fail? Did a power supply die? What's happening on the temperature on the CPUs? This is pretty important stuff, right? In the past, you may have installed agents directly in the console OS to do these to expose this information so you can see it in your console, however you like to monitor it. That moves to a new model in ESXi based on SIM. SIM is a DMTF standard. It stands for Common Information Model, and it's a standards-based method for exposing up hardware health information, and in fact, quite a lot more. And ESXi has embraced the SIM standard, and this is our preferred approach, and we work with vendors to ensure that they give us SIM providers, which are then built into the product so that it can expose up the information that you need for hardware health monitoring. Let's go a little bit lower into the stack. Now we deal with commands for configuration and diagnostics. So Chara is going to talk a lot more about this. I'm just going to touch on it briefly. But we have two really powerful sets of command line tools which run off the host and communicate with the ESXi box. So a lot of the things that you used to be able to do in the COS, because it's gone, you can now do those same things using these really, really powerful scripting tools off the host. The two of them that I'll mention are vCLI, which is available on both Windows and Linux, and then PowerCLI, which of course is based on PowerShell and is Windows specific. Both of those really, really powerful command sets in order to do configuration and diagnostics. So we'd like to say it's a perfect world and nothing ever goes wrong, but occasionally things do. And you're going to say to me, it's like, hey, hang on a second, what happens if I really need to get onto that box because something's gone really bad and I can't get to it via the APIs? Well, it turns out that ESXi actually has a support shell. There is a tech support mode console directly on the box, which you can SSH into and execute all the commands that you would need to do for low-level configuration, maintenance, and especially troubleshooting. Now, that shell is a very restricted environment. It is not the console OS. It's really designed to address that single use case of if something really bad goes wrong, you have the tools in order to get in there and fix it. Now, Chara will give you a bunch more details on exactly how this works and how you can lock that down so that under normal circumstances, you don't have to have that exposed. So if you're a very security-conscious customer, we have the tools to lock down the host so that you cannot SSH onto it. You cannot even get to the shell from a console if that's how secure you want ESXi to be. That you cannot do on ESX. It's a really, really powerful point. And then right at the bottom level of the stack are the infrastructure agents, which should just work. Those used to run in the console OS. We've moved those inside of the VM kernel, which is basically the operating system that is ESXi. And they continue as normal. So the usual things like hostd, VPXA, network time protocol, the syslogging infrastructure, and so on. They all continue to run within ESXi. So as you can see, I've mapped pretty much everything that you had on the left-hand side, which you have on ESX, has something on the right-hand side on ESXi. Sometimes you'll do things a little bit differently. That's true. But all of the functionality is all there. Okay, let's get to the next slide. Right, hardware monitoring and systems management. I already spoke about this a little bit. This is the common information model. Again, this is this DMTF standard for hardware monitoring and actually some additional functionality beyond that. This is an agentless standards-based monitoring infrastructure. We work with our partners, both OEMs and IHVs, so that when they produce hardware, they give us a SIM provider which plugs into the VM kernel and surfaces up the hardware monitoring information which they collect from the actual devices on the box. We have a SIM broker, which is a software layer, which then interfaces it to the network, and we can consume that information from a number of sources. So, for example, vCenter is able to go in and talk to the boxes and get the information via SIM, or a number of third-party applications can do the same thing. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that in upcoming slides. A new feature coming up, actually, well, this is out in 4.1. So VMware Update Manager can now deploy offline bundles. I know this is something that some of you guys probably have asked for, and we've responded to this one. And essentially, this is going to make it a lot easier for you to get those drivers, SIM providers, and other modules which you might require from a server vendor and include them in your ESXi images. So previously, we did not support offline bundles. Now they are available as of the 4.1 release in VMware Update Manager. I mentioned that there are a couple of ways in which you can, well, several ways in which you can consume hardware monitoring information. So on this slide over here, we have an example of two rather well-known applications for doing this kind of thing. We have HP System Insight Manager and Dell Open Manage, both of which are now capable of consuming the SIM indications which are surfaced up from the platform through SIM providers from those two vendors. Of course, these are just two examples. There are plenty more out there. And since we are VMware, I have to say, well, you can do all of this, of course, through vCenter as well. So here are some examples of detailed health monitoring information that you get surfaced up within the vCenter console. On the right-hand side, I think you'll see a bunch of stuff there about power states and so on for some particular server hardware. And of course, all of this as well is wired into the alarms infrastructure, so you can get alerts as to what's going wrong if something is in fact wrong with the hardware. The kind of stuff that you typically see here is stuff like fan status, power status, temperature, and whatnot. I think there's also a slide here which talks about, yep, here it is. You can also get information about the installed software components. So if you'd like to know, gee, do I have exactly the right version of the monitoring SIM providers from, say, Dell or HP or whoever the vendor happens to be, you can now go in either in vCenter or going directly to the host and pull out that information. That is all exposed. I'm not going to read through this chart, clearly. What the whole point here is to really show you that the ecosystem has embraced ESXi, and many of these vendors already have full support, and and other vendors are going to be introducing support for ESXi pretty shortly. So this just gives you an idea of some of the folks out there who already have products out there that do support ESXi today. And now I'm going to hand off to Charu, who's going to take us through the next section of the talk. Thanks, Charu.
Okay, thank you. All right, so one of the things that Sean mentioned was this category of functionality that we're calling infrastructure services. And so by this, we mean things that you need to do not to run any kind of virtualization, but really to integrate your ESX hosts with your larger environment. And so from this table, you see some of that functionality: time synchronization, centralized log collection, persistent logging, SNMP. So these are things that are provided in a different way in ESXi as compared to ESX. What what I'm trying to highlight here is in this table, I'm showing things that are both there existing in ESXi 4.0, as well as what's new in 4.1. So the first couple of rows there, you'll see that in the ESX world, you just had agents running in the service console that provided different kinds of capabilities, NTP agent, syslog, SNMP. In the ESXi world, those are now taken care of by built-in functionality. Basically, you can't have an agent running, so we have to go and specifically add that capability into the actual ESXi image itself. The fourth row there is one that's pretty interesting, persistent logging. As you probably know, VMware, the various agents that run in the service console, such as hostd and vPXA, now run as kind of modules or components in the ESXi kernel itself. Now, in the ESX world, they created log files, and you need a place to put a file, so we just use the file system of the service console. But since we've taken away the service console, we can't do that anymore. And so one of the things with ESXi is that you would now send log files to a data store. Now, I should have possibly highlighted this in a different color because in earlier versions of ESXi, that sending log files to a data store was not configured automatically for you. It's kind of something that you had to go and do. And most people, since we didn't remind you to do it, it wasn't something that normally you had done. But now with ESXi 4.1, we automatically configure this for you. So now the files do get sent to a persistent location somewhere on one of your data stores. What I'm highlighting in red actually are some of the new features. So these are really the features that I think take ESXi to the point where it's truly able to run inside your enterprise. The first piece there is local access authentication. That means anytime you want to access the ESX, the hypervisor host directly, in other words, not going through vCenter, but accessing it directly, you need to basically provide credentials. Now, in the ESX world, what people typically did was they would run some kind of agent in the service console that would integrate with the directory service, typically Active Directory. And so what you then could do is then provide an Active Directory credential every time you wanted to log into the service console. Well, now with ESXi 4.1, we've actually built in that service into the product. So there's built-in Active Directory integration right in ESXi 4.1. We use the same technology actually in ESX 4.1, so you actually get it in both places. But I'll go over some of this in a little bit more detail in the next few slides as well. The last piece there is around large-scale deployment. How do you deploy on a massive scale when you have more than, let's say, more than a dozen, 2 dozen hosts? You're starting to get to a larger and larger environment. What if you have hundreds of hosts or even thousands of hosts, like some of our biggest customers? What's a way to kind of get the systems up and running in a large-scale automated way? So some of the capabilities that we have in ESX are now available in ESXi with 4.1 that we fully support. So one would be boot from SAN, another one would be PXE installation, and maybe a subset of PXE installation is a scripted installation. Those are all new in vSphere 4.1. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these new features that are there in 4.1. So Active Directory integration. As I mentioned, it provides authentication for any local interactions. What does that mean? It means if you log into the box directly using the vSphere client, or you run one of these remote command line tools like VCLI or PowerCLI, and you want to run a command on the box directly. So it's providing authentication for those services. Some of you may or may not know that you can go and create local users on both ESX and ESXi manually. You can go to the ESXi host and create a local account. That's always been possible. Of course, that's not very scalable because every local account is by definition local, and you have to kind of replicate that across all your environments. You have to create it individually, and the password doesn't have to be the same across everything. So having it all managed centrally in one place is a lot better in terms of being able to do things more manageably. And from a security and compliance point of view, it's better to have things centrally defined as well. So what we do, this feature that we have works with Active Directory users as well as groups. And where do groups come into play here? You understand you can log in as a user, but you don't normally log in using a group name. But it comes into play when it comes to privileges. So just because you exist in Active Directory as a user doesn't mean that you can log into your ESXi box and do things. You actually have to be granted a specific privilege to do things. So the way it works here is that you can go into your ESXi system and grant specific privileges to specific users or specific AD groups. The kinds of privileges we have, it's similar to the vCenter roles and permissions system, except it's kind of like a mini version that's local on every ESXi host. We have the built-in roles that we have. Basically, there's full administrator, there's read-only, and then there's, no access is a role. You can go and create a custom role if you want as well. And so what you could do, for example, is to have an AD group, which is called, ESX admins. Then you can grant the @AD group the full administrative privileges on the box. So that means any member of that AD group will automatically get administrative privileges. And if you're not out in that group, then you have no access. That's the default. So actually, we've gone to the effort of making that the default. So actually, if there is an AD group called ESX admins, then any member of that group automatically will get administrative privileges. So in that sense, you don't have to go to every single ESXi host and configure this kind of privilege model. It's already done for you. Of course, you can go and create additional groups in AD, and then want to say cluster 1 admins. Then you would go to all the hosts in cluster 1 and grant the administrative privileges to cluster 1. So you can kind of break it up that way as well. But by default, if you're a member of the AD group with that string ESX admins, you do get full administrative privileges through this AD authentication. Setting this up is pretty easy. All you need to do is go to the host. I'm showing how you do it through the vSphere client. You just click on the host, go to the configuration tab, and click on one of the items which is called directory services or authentication services. And it'll pop up this window. All you need to do is select the directory service type, which today there's only Active Directory as an option. When you click on Join Domain, first you enter the domain name, click on Join Domain, and it'll pop up a new window. And all you need to do is provide the credentials of a user who actually has the permissions to join domains. And that's it. That's all you have to do. And from that point onwards, the host has joined to Active Directory, and there's nothing else that you need to do. If you go back to your Active Directory administrative tools, you'll see in the Active Directory computers object listing that the host appears. So in this little example, there's a host called vESXi-sigma. It appears as a computer listing in the computers object listing. And then the vSphere client itself shows you that, okay, this is the domain that we've joined to. In this case, vmworld.com. All right, so that's the Active Directory service new in ESXi 4.1. Another new feature is boot from SAN. Boot from SAN is fully supported now in ESXi 4.1. It was actually only experimentally supported in ESXi 4.0. Now I say it's fully supported for Fiber Channel, iSCSI, as well as FCOE. However, it's fully supported for certain hardware that actually is qualified for this purpose. So first of all, you'll see that this is a screenshot taken from our configuration guide. You'll see that for the ESXi type of ESXi host, you need to have a network adapter that supports IBFT, iSCSI boot firmware table. So the network adapter has to support that. And in addition, I think it's important to point out that the vendor has to have qualified the NIC for this purpose. So we support this, but only for that hardware that actually has been qualified for this purpose, has been tested. And if you go to our hardware compatibility list, our HCL, you'll see the NICs that actually have passed this qualification. There's a question over there.
Yeah, so in the future, is there any plans to booting straight from NFS, or if we're a big NetApp shop, should we just plan on trying to make it work over ISO?
So the question is there any plan in the future of booting from NFS? I guess that's not something that I can really talk about right now. I don't know, do you know? I guess we can't see anything right now about that. Don't know. But that's good feedback to hear, though. If you want to provide us more details later on, please come up here. Another new feature is around PXE installation. Hopefully most of you are familiar with PXE. It's a way of deploying an OS image onto a host that's obtained from a central repository. So we support PXE in ESXi 4.1. Again, it wasn't fully supported in 4.0, but it's fully supported in 4.1. And it's a way of having a central image somewhere that you can then deploy across all your hosts. So it's much easier to maintain that central repository. So it's similar to what you would think. You just instead of booting off a CD, you boot from the network, and then you can follow the normal install process. Answering questions about what to put in and things like that. This is actually part of the bigger picture around installation. So this flowchart shows you that you can actually do both interactive and scripted installations now in ESXi 4.1. So in both cases, interactive or scripted, you can boot off the network or boot off a CD to get the installation process going. In the interactive case, once you've booted either from the network or from CD, then you follow the prompts and do the installation. But in the scripted case, you can script the entire process. And the things that you would script are as follows. You boot an installer, and then you can tell that installer from where to load the ESXi image. That's one option. It can be residing on the local disk the CD that you've used, or from some network location, using the protocols listed there. You can also specify where the configuration script is. The configuration script is the script that lets you sort of describe how the host should be configured. That can also reside in multiple places. And then finally, that config script can then also point to these other kinds of scripts, pre-install, post-install, and first boot script. So once you've sort of set it up, you can actually have this whole end-to-end process for doing an entire scripted installation. We support this for installing from a network location onto a local disk. So that's the kind of thing we support. So it's a way of basically getting the image onto your local disk in an automated fashion. All right, so going into command line interfaces. As Sean mentioned, our two primary interfaces are vCLI and PowerCLI. And both of these are built upon the vSphere APIs. They're both using some form of the vSphere SDK. And the great advantage of using these is that they're built upon the same API that the entire product uses. So you automatically get the benefits of the same kind of whatever authentication you're using, you'll automatically use for these scripting environments. Any kinds of roles and privileges that you set up will automatically apply to these commands. So if you try to run a command that you don't have permission to do, then it won't be allowed. And then you get the same event logging. So in the vCenter events database table, you'll see things that you do with these command lines will be recorded. Now this is in great contrast to the Service Console. When you do scripting in the Service Console, you essentially have to worry about setting up an entire parallel environment for doing authentication, roles and privileges, and logging. And it's totally not unified at all with what you do through vSphere Client or through vCenter Server. So for that reason alone, vCLI and PowerCLI both work with classic ESX in addition to ESXi. I think just for compliance reasons alone, you would even want to use these with the classic ESX environment, just to avoid that headache of dealing with commands and things issued in the Service Console that you then have to track separately and independently from everything else. One thing I'll point out is that vCLI is available as a standalone installation for Linux as well as Windows, but it also comes bundled as a part of VMA, which is the vSphere Management Assistant. vSphere Management Assistant is a sort of a pre-built virtual appliance that contains vCLI plus a bunch of other tools. And it's actually a very handy and convenient way to obtain the vCLI as well as the other tools, and to have it in sort of a common environment that other people would be using. And I actually just attended a very good session on using the VMA. We'll have a kind of a page at the end which will show you the session ID, so you can go back later and view the recording or download the slides. But it was a really good overview of how to use Vima exactly, how to deploy it, how to use it in action, some tips for how to use it. So Vima is a pretty good way of getting the VCLI. Of course, you can also deploy it onto standalone Linux or Windows systems as well. PowerCLI, I won't go into it here. I mean, I'm sure many of you already know and love it. It's been proven to be extremely popular, and we have a lot of information about that, a lot of sessions and demos on PowerCLI out here today. So what's new in vSphere 4.1? There's some new commands that we've added to the VCLI. I'm not going to really list these. There, you can see that this particular set is related to storage. And it's just showing you that in certain, there's more new commands that I'll be talking about in some future slides, but we're continually enhancing the VCLI to let you do more and more from this kind of remote environment. All right, next piece is around diagnostics and troubleshooting. This is probably, when you talk to customers, this is if they're holding out for the service console, this is the one reason they are, because they want to, they understand, they agree with all the benefits of ESXi, but this is the one thing that they feel that they cannot do sort of adequately enough without a service console. And so what I'm here to tell you today is that with vSphere 4.1, I think we've pretty much addressed all the use cases around diagnostics and troubleshooting. And so the point is that when you do diagnostics and troubleshooting ESXi, we now have a variety of tools for you to use. In the ESX world, all you have is a service console, and that's it. But as you know, it's a lot of overhead and baggage and management headache. So what we've done when we take away the service console, we've added in some other options around troubleshooting. So we have the VCLI commands, the DCUI, a way to do quick troubleshooting through your browser, and then tech support mode. So I'm going to go over these in turn now. So the VCLI, just a little bit more detail. The VCLI has a familiar set of ESX CFG commands that you might be familiar with from the service console. It doesn't have every single one, but it has most of them. They're mapped to the prefix VICFG. Anything that begins with ESX CFG is actually a symlink to VICFG. So in addition to those commands, there's other ones that are there. So VMKFS tools, VMware-CMD, remote ESX top, which is basically the same as ESX top. And then a new suite of tools, ESXi. You saw a bit of an example earlier. So all of these tools here can help you do a lot of troubleshooting and diagnostics on their own. What's new in vSphere 4.1? We've added some new VCLI commands that are focused on sort of troubleshooting diagnostics. The first one is around network. ESXi network is a family of commands that focus on networking. So it's kind of meant to be sort of like a netstat equivalent. It'll list active connections, or they'll list the active entries in the ARP table. Around NFS, we've actually enhanced ESX top and our ESX top to provide more statistics for NFS. And then finally, we've actually specifically added a command for dealing with VMs, specifically how to kill a VM. So one of the most common use cases people have brought to us for using the service console is that occasionally they'll encounter a VM that's not responding to a kill command. It's just not dying. So they need to go in and kill it manually. So we specifically added this VCLI command that will go in and kill a VM that's not responding to normal stop operations. And it is designed to work when the VM is not well behaving. So it really goes in, figures out what's going on at a low level, and kills the appropriate processes. Does it for you automatically. So this does eliminate one of the most common uses for needing to log into the service console. All right, around the DCUI, just for level set, the DCUI is the screen that appears when you go to the console of an ESX host. If you go to the screen or the physical ESXi host, you see this menu-driven interface. And there's some things here that are useful for doing quick troubleshooting. One is the ability to restart your management agents. This also is kind of a highly cited, and one of the top reasons for using the service console is to kick your management agents, restart host D or something like that. We built this into the product. It's actually been there from day one, the ability to go and restart management agents. Just go to this menu option and select it, and it'll ask for confirmation, and then it'll do it for you. Other things you can do is to reset configurations. So, for example, if you've put your management network onto a distributed switch and that somehow got misconfigured, you can reset it so it goes back onto a standard switch. More extreme is to actually reset everything to a fresh factory state to wipe out all configurations, which will then reboot the box. That's another option there. Okay, one feature that anytime I talk to customers, they usually find this pretty neat is the fact that you can do a lot of viewing of different kinds of files right within your browser. This is one of those things that actually, it's not new to 4.1. It was there in previous versions, but it's kind of worth pointing out. First of all, you have to have a browser that can talk to the management interface of an ESXi host. Secondly, you need administrator credentials. You need to have the password, username and password of some user that has administrative credentials. But when you point your browser to this particular form of URL, provide the credentials, you'll then see a list of files here. It's a way to see all the configuration files that we expose on ESXi. And if you click on a file, you just see the contents right then and there in your browser. So it's actually a nice way to see, okay, how exactly is something configured? Just go to your browser and point to it. You can also go there and look at your log files. See the log files in the same manner. Typically, you'll be the messages file or hostd file or the VPXA file. So you could actually point to your log file and then use your browser's search functionality and quickly zero in on some particular event or something like that. It's very easy to do. And you can also go in and browse through your data stores. So using the URL of the form there, you can see all the data stores that are connected to the host, drill down into the individual VM folders, and then within the VM folder, you can look at the VMX file. You can obviously download it to your local host if you want to. You can look at the disk descriptor file, things like that. So you can basically, with this browser interface, view and download files. The last piece here is tech support mode, which Sean had alluded to earlier. First of all, how many of you have heard of tech support mode? I guess not quite half of you. So tech support mode is a low-level shell that's available on ESXi. Tech support mode is essentially what we've done is we've compiled a binary which provides a shell plus some utilities, and we've made it available on the ESXi host. And it's there for doing this use case, as Sean mentioned, of low-level troubleshooting and diagnostics. And in previous versions of ESXi, we always had this there as sort of a ways for support, technical support to help you, but it was sort of not really quite, it was sort of hidden and not really well supported. So what we've done in ESX 4.1 is to make it a fully supported feature of the product. So I'm going to go over how it works in the next few slides. First of all, with tech support mode, there are actually two ways to access it. You can go to the console of the host, press Alt F1, and you'll see the login window, a login prompt appear. And you can log in, and you'll see this sort of thing here. It'll remind you that you've activated tech support mode, and whatever you're doing is being logged. It also reminds you that there are other tools that you can use before you resort to tech support mode. So that's one way of doing it. The second way is to actually SSH into the box. So we do provide an SSH mechanism for going in and then invoking that shell remotely. And you see the same prompts here. So two ways to access tech support mode. There's also different ways to turn on and turn off tech support mode, because really that's the whole point, is that if you have a powerful interface like this, you want to be able to control it pretty well. So we have different ways of controlling how it behaves. First of all, you can turn on and turn off, as I mentioned. Here, there's different ways of doing it. In this example, I'm showing using the DCUI with this screenshot. You can go in and disable and enable both local and remote tech support mode independently. The second thing you can do is set a timeout. by default, there is no timeout, but one best practice would be to set a timeout, so that what happens is that if you do go toggle on tech support mode, it'll automatically shut itself off after some period of time. You can set the number in increments of minutes. And so what that means is that maybe as a policy you would say, well, I want to be able to use tech support mode for support purposes. If I go turn it on and I sort of am doing something, I don't want it leave left on permanently. So with the timeout, what happens is that running sessions don't get terminated. So if you're in the middle of some debug session, you won't get kicked out. But any new session will then get rejected. And the last piece here, which is probably the most important one in terms of customers who are security conscious as well as that have to adhere to compliance mandates, is that all the commands that you issue in tech support mode do get sent to syslog, to the messages file. So you have a full audit trail of everything that's happening in tech support mode. You can also enable and disable tech support mode in vCenter server. Using the vSphere client, you can go to the configuration tab of a host and click on security profile, and you'll see a menu there. And you can also do it in host profiles. So if you're using host profiles, it's a way of setting it as well. So what are the recommended uses and not recommended uses? Sean kind of talked about that. It's recommended for support, troubleshooting, and break fix. That's really the intended purpose of this. The other piece here is that I talked about scripted install, where you have this ability to run pre, post, and first boot scripts. Those scripts do use the shell, this tech support mode shell to run. And so obviously you'd need to write and debug those scripts inside that shell. But that's the only script that we recommend that you use tech support mode for. And any other use should be discouraged. So any other kinds of scripts, leaving it open for running commands periodically or trying to run cron jobs or anything like that, that's all discouraged. You should use all the other tools that you have at your disposal instead of tech support mode. We've hopefully convinced you, those other tools are extremely powerful and more than adequate for doing your day-to-day routine operations, and only for break-fix situations should you need to use tech support mode. And to emphasize this fact, anytime you have tech support mode turned on, you'll see a warning in the vSphere client, and a banner will appear there with it, and your host will have a little exclamation point on it saying that tech support mode has been activated. And that's just serving as a reminder to say, okay, you've turned on tech support mode. Why don't you get on with what you're doing, and once you're done, turn it off. So within tech support mode, just a minor point here, we've added some additional commands that weren't there before. This is more if you had the experience of using tech support mode in the previous version of the product, there are some commands that hadn't been there. And these are again, pretty low-level kinds of diagnostic type of commands that are now available in tech support mode. vSCSI stats, NC, which is a version of netcat, and TCP dump-UW, which is a version of TCP dump. So just as a summary, during normal operations, you'd want to use vCenter server, vCLI, things like that. If you're going to do some troubleshooting, you'd want to start with vCLI and browser-based methods, anything that works remotely. That's the place to start when you're doing troubleshooting. But if things go really wrong, that's when you would resort to these more direct access methods, such as DCUI and tech support mode. The last thing I'll talk about here is lockdown mode. Now, this actually represents one of the biggest advantages of using ESXi over ESX, is the fact that because everything is done from a remote point of view, you can actually totally lock down the box and make it so that all interaction with the box is forced to occur through vCenter server. So this is what lockdown mode is meant to do. Now, in the table there, you see in the various rows, there's different ways of accessing the host. On the top row, you see access based upon the API, which includes things like vSphere client, PowerCLI, etc. Then you have the SIM-based interface that Sean mentioned, the specific way of accessing hardware information. You have the DCUI and then tech support mode, both local and remote. So during normal operations, all of those are available to you. But when you turn on lockdown mode on a host, you actually shut off most of these ways of accessing the host. In the case of the vSphere API, what happens is that only vCenter server can access the box. And it has a specialized user, VPX user, that does everything on its behalf. But no other user can actually access the box. In terms of the SIM interface, no SIM client can actually directly contact the box. They actually need to obtain a special ticket from vCenter in order to perform the query to get the hardware status. With the DCUI, we actually continue to allow DCUI access, but only by the root user and not by any other sort of other user account. And then tech support mode and local and remote tech support mode do get turned off. So that's what you have with lockdown mode. What that essentially means is that all you can do is manage the box through vCenter server, and that's it. The DCUI is available to you so that you can turn off lockdown mode in case vCenter server goes down or is somehow unavailable. So that way, the normal operation would be that, okay, you're using vCenter for everything. If vCenter is not working, you want to go back to manage that host, go to the DCUI, log in as root, and then disable lockdown mode. But for those customers who are very paranoid or very security conscious, we have the option of turning off the DCUI. So that's an independent toggle that you can set. You can go and turn off the DCUI. So what I've highlighted in red is to say that once you kind of X out that row, you'll see that everything in the right-hand column becomes none. And so what you have is a totally locked down system. And so, as I mentioned, if you're on the extremely paranoid side, this is what you want. And in that case, if vCenter server goes down, then you actually cannot do anything. The box is basically unmanageable at that point. You either have to get vCenter server back up and running, or you have to basically reimage the box. Now, so this is something that obviously we'd only recommend. You have to decide for yourself whether this is your security profile. Are you that kind of customer, and is your vCenter server that unreliable that you can't rely upon it coming back? So do keep in mind that all of these switches, whether it's tech support mode, DCUI, lockdown mode, these are all just toggles. You can turn them on and off at will as you want, as long as vCenter server is running in most cases. So it's not like something not like a one-way door that you're going through. So even if you've turned off DCUI, a typical mode of operation would be that you have a fully locked down environment. But if one host is acting funny, then go ahead and disable lockdown mode on that host to fix what needs to be fixed, and then go turn it on again. And hopefully that process of disabling lockdown mode becomes part of your, kind of a procedure that you have for troubleshooting. That procedure can be, possibly tracked and audited, so you have that's just based on sound management policy. All right, just to summarize the new features in ESXi and vSphere 4.1, I didn't go over all these. I went over a lot of them. But the point is that between ESXi 4.1 and on the right-hand side you see ESX 4.1, we've achieved near parity. We kind of feel that with 4.1, we've gotten to the point where you can safely cut over from ESX to ESXi architecture and have everything you need in order to successfully run your data center. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sean to go over the next steps that you have for you as a customer.
Thanks very much, Charu. So a lot of useful information out there for you guys. Charu, obviously quite the expert on this. I'm going to point you to some more resources which Charu has been working on as we go through the next few steps. So call to action here. Go to the party. I don't know whether I mentioned that. Start testing ESXi immediately. If you're not already deploying ESXi in your environment, this is a great time to start testing it. ESXi 4.1 has a great set of features. Charu mentioned many of them. There are actually plenty more out there. So go ahead and start rolling out ESXi, at least into your test environment, see how that goes, and then start moving over. Remember, it is going to transition exclusively to ESXi coming up in the next major release. Next one is ensure your third-party solutions are ESXi ready. I did show you a big list of partners out there who do have tools that already support ESXi. There may be some that are not on that list. If you happen to have one of those, talk to your vendor, make sure that they get ESXi supported, make sure it works for your environment. That would include things like monitoring solutions, backup, and so on. The great news, though, is if this all works out, that's the last you're ever going to see of agents coming from all of those vendors. So it makes your lives a lot easier. Charu spent a lot of time describing what's available for remote management for ESXi. So go ahead and familiarize yourself with all of those tools. They're really, really powerful. So it's a great set of tools there with vCLI and especially PowerCLI. Both are pretty awesome. Next one, I would say if you're going to be doing an upgrade to vSphere anytime soon, if it's on your roadmap, consider doing that to ESXi as well, and especially 4.1. A lot of the features listed there, Charu went into several of them. So 4.1, if you haven't already gone to the vSphere series of releases, is a great target to aim for. Next one, and I've got to thank Charu and his team for this one. They've done an awful lot of work in putting together an info center on the VMware.com website, which collects a whole bunch of great information about how you can transition from ESX to ESXi. So you'll find a bunch of guidance, white papers. I know Charu's been really busy on a great blog, which describes a bunch of customer scenarios which are pretty interesting, where people are asking, hey, how do I do this on ESXi? I used to do it this way on ESX. So things like monitoring, management, and so on, using the remote CLIs that are available, you'll find a bunch of information on this site and in Charu's blog. And then Charu's also been working as the technical editor. Yeah, this guy doesn't actually sleep. So Charu, can you tell us a little bit about this book that's coming up?
This book is being written by Dave Mishchenko, which many of you probably know from the VMware community. He's very prolific. I don't even know if he's here this week. I hope I'll get to meet him. But he's been working very hard on this book, and it's going to be a very long and very detailed book. It's about 500 pages, so a lot of information. And it's also up to date for vSphere 4.1. So it's going to be a great resource. I've been editing all the chapters, and they all look great. And so it's coming out towards the end of this month, end of September.
Thanks. Sounds really good. And if you haven't had enough of VMworld 2010 yet, there are a bunch of good talks. I think some of these may have already passed, but as Charu mentioned, you can always go back online and get the recording of that and view the slides. So there are several of these which I think Charu had selected as really interesting if you're planning your transition to ESXi. Charu, do you want to chat about some of your favorites?
Yeah, there's the one about VMA, the MA6580. So I don't know if it's going to be repeated again, but definitely I recommend looking at that. And the labs are also another great place to see how things work, actually.
Super, thanks Charu. So that's it for this talk, guys. We do have microphones set up, I think, in the passage. So if there are any questions, please go ahead to the mic and fire away. We'll do our best to answer them.
Thank you.